And I wanted to have you guys taste our whole grain croissants, because this was something that we really worked on a lot of different ways.
Twist our arms to make it. Thank you.
And what was the problem with this was that the whole grain flour in it was absorbing too much liquid, and it wasn't letting it get that crusty rise with all the holes in the middle.
I just want to point out what a tour de force those croissants are.
This has come to Jesus.
Katie is amazing, and I have had the head of Wegmans try to talk me out of this recipe. It's like, you want the recipe, you get it when you buy the company. So just because Katie can make these kind of things, it is possible to do everything. And I understand about the gritty thing. I would just say, use more yeast. Try to, if you can, put egg whites or something in it, because you've got some protein in there to substitute for the gluten protein, if you don't mind. So just something to leaven it. But it's hard, and this is an amazing baker. So I don't want you guys to get disappointed if your stuff has a little bit of birthing issue. Okay.
This had a lot of birthing issue. When she came to me and said she wanted a whole grain croissant, I was like, that's not going to work, because it just can't be done. It won't get the rise.
Except I ate one in Connecticut, and I said, yes, it will.
Yeah, it can be done. And what the turning moment for us is that I really needed to ferment the flour first. And using this is my sourdough starter, if you guys want to smell it. But we make a sourdough starter, an overnight sourdough starter, with the whole wheat flour. And the whole wheat flour really needs that 18 hours of fermentation to soften the grain and to make it so that it reacts more like a regular flour and is able to rise without cutting through and then falling again. We had a lot of flat croissants. My friends still ate them, but they still taste good, yeah. So the long fermentation. Also, I want to talk a little bit about the rye bread, because we use the same thing here. We make a rye starter. This is our cranberry walnut rye. I hope you guys aren't full yet.
These are incredible.
Thank you.
This is Katie's pet. She has it named.
What fat do you use in the croissant recipe?
Butter.
You can tell me.
Yeah.
Oh, you
Like
can
a
taste it.
like grass-fed.
We use Cabot butter. I don't know if it's grass-fed or not, but it's from the Cabot farms in Vermont. Yeah. The good butter really does make a difference. It does. For something like this, I think that recipe is 33% butter by weight. So if you're going to have something that's that much, you need to.
Just made croissants and made them with the Kerrygold, and they were amazing.
Kerrygold is my butter of choice at home. That's what we use, yeah.
And they were gone in like a
Yeah. Yeah. But sometimes they can get greasy if you use a poor quality butter. If you try and, a lot of times people will cut it with margarine or shortening to kind of make it flakier, but it doesn't melt at the same temperature, and so it kind of has that mouth coating greasiness to it. And that's, for me, if you're going to have something with butter in it, just have it with butter. Get the good butter, spend the money, spend the time, and do it right. So. Oh, good. This is available all the time. We actually grind, we're going to talk about it a little bit later, but we have a mill in Berryville called Locke's Mill, and they have a organic. Do you know what year Locke's Mill was made?
What year the mill was made?
Yeah.
The building is 1878, but there's been a mill on the site pre-1750. But every once in a while, the Shenandoah would wash the mill away.
Yeah, it's right on the river. But we grind our own rye flour for it, and we do an overnight fermentation with the rye flour as well, because rye flour has an enzyme in it called amylase, and amylase, in order to be able to feed the yeast, it needs to ferment. Otherwise, the yeast can't use the food. The food being the starches that are in it. It needs to be unlocked by these amylase, these enzymes. So we ferment it overnight. We mix the dough, we ferment it overnight, and we bake it the next day. And since it's a sourdough, that's where you get that kind of tang to it.
Katie, can you explain what the difference between ferment and let something sit in liquid is overnight?
It's kind of the same thing.
Right, I just wanted you to explain that.
Okay, so fermentation is the process of yeast eating starch and giving off CO2. So CO2 is the bubbles. That's what makes this little guy. His name is Jeffrey, I call him, but that's where he gets all his little bubbles from. Sitting something overnight, soaking it overnight, is a good way to start fermentation. If you were to crack the grains first to expose the starchy inside part and let it sit overnight, usually about 2 days, you'll start to see bubbles happen, and that's the natural yeast that's on the outside starting to eat the starches that are on the inside, digesting them, and turning it into something like this.
How much of the starter do you have to use for your bread?
Since it's an overnight fermentation, we make the dough and then we rest the whole dough overnight in the refrigerator. We actually don't use that much of it. For I think it's a 16 loaf batch, loaves being 1.5 pounds this size, I think we use 200 grams, which is a little under half a pound. So not a whole lot. We do use a commercial yeast as well. We use this for the flavor, but it's just not strong enough. The rye flour is so heavy. It has a different kind of gluten in it. Gluten is actually, she talked about it a little bit earlier, it's made up of 2 building blocks. Glutenin, which is the strength part, and gliadin, which is the elasticity part. And so when you have a normal whole wheat bread, the ratios of that are what we're kind of used to with a nice fluffy loaf. But rye flour and barley flour, they still have gluten in them, but it's different. So they're very strong, but they're not very elastic, and that's why you get really dense rye breads. And if you want a really fluffy rye bread, you have to cut it up to like 33% rye and then 67% white flour if you want like a Jewish rye or something that's like a sandwich bread. Now, in Germany, they make 100% rye bread, and they cook it overnight in the oven, in the receding oven, and then end up with like a brick. And they let it sit for 48 hours, and then you slice it really thin, and you eat it with, butter and fish. And it's delicious, but it's not a sandwich bread, so it just depends on what you're looking for. But rye bread in general, rye flour needs to be fermented before you add it to your bread. Questions? Has anybody ever tried to make rye bread before? No? You have? How did it turn out?
It was pretty good. I used my husband's sourdough starter. I did sourdough rye, and I'm trying to think of, I got local rye flour, and it was excellent.
Yeah.
But it was very dense.
It can be dense, and I think when you love rye, you just kind of love that texture. It doesn't need to try and be wheat bread. It can be rye bread, and it can be good on its own. Another fun way that you can kind of incorporate whole grains into your cooking, this is just something I put together yesterday, but browning flour. Has anybody ever tried browning flour or browning grains before they make a pilaf or anything? So I'll pass these around. This is toasted brown rice. You can smell it. You can taste it if you want. It tastes really nutty. And this is just toasted flour.
Can you guys just pass the spoons and stuff around? If you can do that. Toasting flour is something, if you read old cookbooks, nobody cooked without toasting flour. And if you want, and that's actually not very toasted. I actually toast my flour quite a bit darker than that. If you make gravies in savory dishes like stews and you use some kind of flour as a thickener, it makes a depth. It's like toasting seeds, the difference between like the taste of a toasted almond versus like a raw almond. It gives your gravies and your sauces an incredible depth that we've just forgotten about.
Actually, I read the story, they used to call it miller's flour because so the technique on this is for the grains, if you want to toast grains, it's probably better to do it in the oven. It's more of an even heat. And so what I do is I preheated the oven to 325, and I baked those for 10 minutes, stirring every 2 or 3 minutes until it was like that flavorful. It just smells nutty, and I was worried about the flour. I didn't take it as dark as I could have because it started to smoke. But the flour I did on the stovetop on a medium heat in a heavy bottom pan, and I just stirred it constantly. But I've read about making pasta with flour like that, which I thought was a really interesting thing. And you can use the grains in a pilaf, or you can use, I mean, millet toasts great. I toasted the millet before I cooked it for the bread, for the einkorn bread. Millet, spelt, farro, all these things benefit from a nice toast on them.
Before she continues, I'm sorry, you guys do pass little plates around so that everybody who's come in gets to taste the old grains versus the new grains and the different kinds of grains that we're lucky now, like Frika, that are once again available. I'm sorry, who did I interrupt? Somebody asked a question?
No, I was just going to ask. So do you ever sleep? Do I ever sleep?
No, she's the Energizer Bunny. She never runs down.
Oh, you have it, Dale?
I do, yes. Once a month, once a month I sleep 24 hours. That's all I need. Well, my husband's a chef too, so we do a lot of fun experimenting and stuff at home too.